Hello, everybody. I just played a game in the Middlesex League against Hammersmith in Division 2, and I'm still reeling from the game. It was a very long one, about 2.5 hours. It's the usual time control of 75 minutes for the first 30 moves, then 15 minutes added on for a quick play finish. And this game was also very important in terms of our division because to really keep our hopes of getting promoted still alive and kicking, we had to beat Hammersmith, who can field a strong team. I was on board too, which was quite good because I wasn't really feeling up to playing. I wasn't really in the mood, and I hadn't eaten all day and other excuses, blah blah blah. So, so just to get on with it, I was playing Paul Kennelly, who was white, and he started with e4. So again, knight f6. If you've seen any of my other personal games, you'll know I play this a lot. e5, knight d5, and now a rather unusual move. Knight c3. So this is avoiding the main lines of d4 and c4, or even knight f3, which would probably transpose back into the Alekhine. This challenges my knight in another way and sort of makes me choose what to do. And it was at this point that I felt that he's a strong player. He's not, he's not a pushover at all. So I'd have to play well to win. But I just wasn't really in the right mind frame to play. So the topic of this video is about whether calculation or sort of judgment, instinct, is more important in chess. And I think the question really is about what type of chess player you are and your experience. So for people who are just starting out or are about 100 ECF, maybe about 1400, 1500 FIDE, I think their calculation can be very important because you need to make sure that you've calculated out the lines, and that is true of strong players too. Don't get me wrong, but generally a stronger player is much more experienced. They've played a lot more, so it's a lot of that is pattern recognition. They can remember positions they've played before, which were very similar, and they can remember what the right sort of move is in that position, so that it becomes part of the player's kind of instinct, and they can make judgment calls, which are generally perhaps not the perfect move, but a good move. So I decided to play this game just almost completely on instinct, just doing what felt right, because I just couldn't calculate anything. I played not the book move, which is c6, defending the knight. I played e6, which would allow my bishop to develop. Then d4. So the previous move, I didn't take his knight because he would have had d takes c3, and that does disobey the rule of taking towards the centre, but it would have allowed his bishop on c1 and the queen to have a lot of space and control of the centre. But now that he's played d4, I can force the recapture with the b pawn. And now this is a lot like a French defence Vinava variation, except in the Vinava, black plays bishop to b4, then takes on c3, so has given up that important dark squared bishop. Here I haven't, so I felt it was an improvement. And I didn't play d5 going into the French, partly because I don't like it, but also because in the French, after white plays e5, you really want to challenge that pawn, So I played d6 instead, attacking it. Bishop f4. And again, I didn't bother to calculate my next move. I just thought, in the Alekhine, I usually take the pawn. So here I'm almost forcing the bishop to recapture. If the pawn recaptures, white will have doubled isolated c-pawns, and that just can't be good for any reason. So he needs to keep the pawns together and take with the bishop. Then I attack the bishop with the knight. I was perfectly happy just to exchange everything off because I have a better pawn structure, and that becomes more important when there are fewer pieces on the board. Bishop f4, and then I thought about playing bishop d6, trying to trade, but first I just thought I would play knight f6 to put my knight on a better square. Knight f3, bishop d6, and I didn't really calculate what would happen if he took, because I just thought I would take back with the pawn, as I'd then have two pawns in the centre, which must be fairly good, and it would let my queen come out to a5 on the next move, because the c7 pawn would have got out the way of the queen. He didn't take, though. He played knight e5, and then I just thought I would fork bishop and pawn. Again, it's a judgment call. A knight on d5 is usually a good thing. It's centralized, it attacks a piece, so it gets a tempo. And it might force white to play bishop d2, which is a more passive move, and that bishop will have been kicked around a lot. So white's development won't be as good as it could be. Bishop g3 was played here, and I then again, I didn't calculate, which nearly cost me a lot. I simply took the pawn. A better move is castles. There are many better moves than taking the pawn, but I just thought, oh, I'll not castle, I'll just take the pawn. It seems easy. So I'm a pawn up and I'm attacking the queen. Now, I missed a move here, which is pretty good for white, and it does give white an advantage. I'll give you 10 seconds or pause the video. Where does white move the queen now? Alright, well, the best move, as was played in the game, is queen f3. So this is a double attack. There's two threats, which are made by the queen. One threat is a simple material threat of taking the knight, and the other is checkmate on f7. So I have to deal with the mate threat first, ideally by not losing a piece. So the only move I could see that didn't lose a piece was bishop takes knight. Then white recaptured with the bishop. So again, taking with the pawn would create an isolated pawn on c2. So bishop takes, and I then decide I'm going to not lose the pawn on g7. I'll attack the bishop. And my opponent here has a few moves. Queen takes knight is okay-ish, but then I'll take on e5, and when he recaptures, we'll be equal on material, but he'll have an isolated c-pawn again. So instead, he took with the bishop, and I thought, I don't want to have to calculate g takes f6, then queen takes knight, and my king is incredibly weak and open, so that just doesn't look good. So I took with the queen, queen takes knight, and then I castled, which creates a caveman threat, as one of my friends calls it, of queen takes f2. So I like that move, castling and also creating a threat. And at this point, also, I felt a little bit more relaxed because we're at move 15, so I've had a little bit of time to get my mind in the right frame of things. And also, I turned up about 15 minutes late for this match because I couldn't find the venue. And at this point, I'd also caught up on time. We both had about 50 minutes left to make 15 more moves until the time control. White parries the threat of queen takes f2 with queen e3. And now I want to get my bishop developed. So bishop d7, bishop c4, which does target the e6 pawn. That pawn is now an isolated pawn, which means I need to hopefully play e5 at some point and exchange pawns off. Then my pawn structure will be fairly good. I'll have 5 pawns and they'll all be on their starting squares, all connected together. So I want to make that bishop move because it's attacking my pawn and pinning it. So again, I didn't really calculate, I just made a forcing move of attacking the bishop, making it budge. And probably the only little bit of calculation I did in this entire game, after bishop e2, I saw that the pawn on d4 was pinned, and I realised that the rook on a1 is undefended. It's a loose piece. So I attacked the pinned piece, which is partly judgment and instinct, but also calculating that d takes c5 just doesn't work. And at this point, rook d1. Then I just think, okay, if I shove the pawn, which I did, I effectively have 3 pawns against 2 on the queen side of the board. The A, B, and C pawns are facing down the A and C pawn. The D4 pawn in my head doesn't really come into play because it can't now affect that 3 versus 2 situation. And if I could exchange D and E pawns off, then I felt my queenside pawns are more advanced, and a queenside majority is far easier to push and make useful than a kingside majority, especially when the white king is destined to either be in the centre or castled on the king side. So that's all based on experience, which a player like me can use to sort of shortcut any calculations. So I felt my pawn structure was now fairly good, apart from my e6 pawn. Bishop f3, and at this point I thought, okay, my bishop is bad because it's being very defensive, whereas white's bishop is on the long diagonal and is more aggressive, able to attack my pawns and also my rook. So I want to exchange bishops. Rook a c8, and my plan is just bishop c6 and bishop takes bishop. White now castled. I played bishop c6. I didn't really look at the move d5 from white because I thought if he wants to exchange off pawns, fine, I'm happy with that. His d4 pawn is able to be defended with c3, making it not a weakness, whereas my e6 pawn is weak, can't be defended by a pawn. So if he wants to exchange pawns, great. He didn't play d5 here. He played, or the move earlier, he instead played bishop takes bishop. I then took, and now he played c3. So if we have a look at this position for a moment, my queen and rook are lined up on f2, but he's overprotecting it. Even if I got my other rook to f7, it still wouldn't be enough to threaten the pawn. So I don't need to worry too much about connecting my rooks over there. Basically, I now thought about endgames because this is an endgame. There's no minor pieces on the board, and we only have 3 pieces each. So in my head, this is endgame territory. And in this type of position, it's the side who has the initiative that generally wins, generally does better. So I'd thought about playing a5 and then pushing b4, but white would have a3 if nothing else. And I felt in the long term, white could maybe attack e6 with all his pieces, and I wouldn't have a target of white to go after. So I played a move that did attack a pawn, rook a6. Rook d2 defends it, and now I just decide to make my rook more useful by putting it on a3. So it's attacking two pawns, and it's going to allow me to play a5 and b4. And I think at this point he might have missed my threat, which I'd created here. It's a very simple idea. I wonder if you can see it. He played rook e1, going after my e6 pawn. What would you play as black in this position? Okay, well, my last move attacked c3, so I want to attack the pinned pawn, b4. And now things are starting to look a little bit, maybe scary. I'm not sure what the right word would be. It's just a little bit uncomfortable for black. If rook c2 were played, I could then maybe play b3 and create a passed pawn on b3 after a takes and then c takes. And my two pawns on a7 and b3 would be able to create havoc on the queen side. So instead, he took the e6 pawn, and I thought, okay, great, queen takes, rook takes. Then I play rook takes. I don't want to play b takes because doubled isolated pawns, again, not fun to have. But I thought I've exchanged off my weak, useless e6 pawn for his anchor on c3. That pawn was holding up my queenside pawns and defending his d pawn. So his kingside majority, again, I don't care about. He's never going to be able to shovel those pawns up. So I have 3 pawns on the queen side against two on a d4 and a2. And I'm threatening checkmate as well on c1. So g3 was played, rook c1 check, which allows me with tempo to play c3. So again, I'm not really calculating, I'm just trying to throw my pawns up. It just feels like the right thing to do. When you have a passed pawn, push it. So that's what I'm doing. And he then doubles rooks on the d file, but I can't really see anything that good to attack for white. So I decide that I'm going to move my rook off the c file to allow c2 and c1 queen. I play rook d1, going behind his pawn. That's also just quite a thematic idea. Then rook e7. So we've got to move 30 now, after my move rook d1. And at that point, I had ages on my clock. I just wasn't able to calculate. I just thought, I'll keep on playing the way I've been playing. And he had a little bit of time. He had 17 minutes and then an extra 15. So we each had quite a while to think. We didn't need to worry about time. But I wasn't really paying too much attention to the clocks. After rook e7, I decide on a plan. I decide rook d2 is a fairly good move. I thought that rook takes d4 might be a little slow because he could play rook c7 going behind my c-pawn, and then the rook on e2 could come to e7, and he would double rooks on the 7th rank. And that's always very unpleasant because the white rooks would be incredibly active, and maybe white could draw or even win with those rooks. So I'm happy to exchange off here because if he takes, I'll take, and he can't prevent d1 queen. And if he moves the rook on e2 away, I have. If he moves the rook on e2 to e1, I could take on f2 with check. win a pawn, and then my rooks would be very, very active. So he plays king f1, and then here, again, I wasn't calculating, and this is the one time I should have done. I played c2 because rook takes d2, c1 equals queen, and he then played rook c7. That's basically the only move he could have played. And then I thought I had it easily won with rook d1 check, rook e1, and then I saw c1 equals queen is a terrible move because he could play rook takes queen, and I wouldn't win anything. But I felt there was a winning move. I looked around, I couldn't see it, and then I had to play rook takes d4. But there is a winning move for black. Can you find it in this position? I'll give you 20 seconds or pause the video. Alright, well, the move is maybe something I should have seen, because it's something I've done in this game a few times. Attack the pinned piece. The rook on e1 is pinned, so rook e8 is the winning move. And white now cannot prevent losing the rook or allowing me to queen the pawn. And that would have been a very easy win for me. Well, I say easy. I had to still take quite a while to win this game, but that would have been a great win. However, that isn't what happened at all. Again, I blame my tiredness for what happened, but you'll see. I play rook takes d4, rook takes c2, and now things are dead level, more or less. However, I thought that I had 2 pawns on the queen side against 1, so maybe I could get something. But first I just doubled rooks, rook c7, and the point of that last move was to play rook 4 d7. I can't move the other rook to d7 because I thought that rook, again, optical illusion, I thought rook e8 was mate, but it obviously is not. But I don't think what I did makes a lot of difference because I thought here he had rook e7, which would allow him to keep a rook on the 7th. However, he played rook e8 check. I took, he took, and pushed my pawn. Then he played the correct move, rook a7, going behind my pawn and also being on the 7th rank. Rook e5, defending the pawn. King g2. So this position is completely drawn, I'll say it. It's absolutely drawn. Black doesn't really have any chance of doing anything, and if white tries to overextend, then black should be able to swap off enough pawns to create a drawn rook and pawn endgame. But I still try and do something because at this point in the match, my team wasn't doing incredibly well. On board 1, it looked like my teammate was going to lose. The board next to me on the other side, board 3, was interesting. I thought my teammate would win, but I wasn't absolutely sure. It could have been a draw if he messed up a little. And on the lower boards, we also seemed to not be doing that well. So I felt a draw wasn't good enough here. I played h6. The idea is just king h7 to g6. So again, I'm not really calculating. I'm just thinking, get my king active. I can't move on the 7th rank except for h7, so that's the route I have to take. h4, and this is quite a common setup that white plays. It's a pawn chain from the centre going to the edge of the board, f2, g3, h4. And generally in these sort of positions when there are very few pieces on the board, just a queen or just a rook, then white can just leave the pawns there, and the king is defending the one pawn that is not being protected by one of its fellows. So king h7. Then my opponent played a move which annoyed me, rook a6. Oh, by the way, if a move annoys me, it's usually a good move if it's played by my opponent. Rook a6 cuts off the king, so I moved my rook to c5. It's just a waiting move, really. I wanted to also throw in a few checks if white played the f-pawn up the board. If white plays pawn to f3 or f4, I have rook c2 check, and then rook takes a2, where I will be winning. King h3. Here rook c2 is an option, but I felt that rook takes a5, rook takes f2, rook b5, rook takes a2, rook takes b4. We'd have 2 pawns each on the king's side, and it would be a dead draw, as is the term, or just draw. So I need to keep the play in this position. I need to keep options for myself. I need to form a plan. I play h5 to prevent white's pawns from advancing too far up the board, and also prevent the white king from advancing. King g2 again, g6 to defend h5. So it's like I've got my own pawn chain, just without a pawn on f7. King back to h3, and here we could have agreed a draw, but I kept playing. King g7. And at this point, we're still, neither side's in time trouble. I have 49 minutes left on my clock. He has 17 minutes left on his clock at move 45. Then f3 was played. King f7. I'm wasting a little bit of time here, but what I did notice was that if the white rook moves off the a6 square, every square it moves to is a little weaker than a6. So if it stays on the a file, my king can advance up the board, and if it stays on the 6th rank, then it's no longer attacking my a5 pawn, so I could then play rook c2 and rook a2. Therefore, my plan is simply to try and make white do a move, put white into Zugzwang. Therefore, white moving the rook is not really an option, which means that if the white king moves to g2 or h2, I have rook c2 check and then taking on a2, winning. Therefore, the king moving is not an option, so white can only move pawns. And he continues to with g4. And here, I had looked at the move rook c3, going after f3, and also threatening rook to a3, and then rook takes a2. Eventually, I decided to not do that, though, because g takes h5 looked very annoying. And if I recapture on h5, there have been enough pawns swapped off that I don't really have any advantage. Rook takes a5, rook takes f3 check, and I think it's still a draw. So I did briefly calculate this, but it felt wrong to play rook to c3. I took, and I'd worked out that if f takes g4, then I have rook c3 check, which allows me to then go to a3, winning the a2 pawn. Then I'll be winning again. So white needs to take with the king. Just to show the f takes line, f takes check, and the king moves back as well, so that's even worse. Rook a3, okay, a few checks are thrown in. Check. And now I felt this must be winning because my pawns are more advanced, and the computer does agree with me. White can try throwing up pawns, but mine are so far advanced, and at this point, my king is also able to stop the white pawn, and my two connected pawns should allow me to queen and win the game. Like this. So rather a long line, and one that, again, I had not calculated at all, but the fact that I'm winning the a3 pawn if f takes, sorry, the a2 pawn, and I've got two connected pawns which are further advanced than white's, should mean that I've won the game. King takes was played though, so he saw this. And now I've got two connected pawns on the queen side against one white pawn, but his two pawns are fractured, is a term that's used. The two pawns are not connected, they're islands, they're on their own. So it's much more difficult to push those two pawns up, because the connected pawns are able to protect each other and work together to come up the board. But the two pawns are lone wolves on the king side. So I felt this still gave me a small advantage. I played king g7, trying to see what happened. f4. So now, if the white king moves back, I can play rook c3 check and rook a3, winning the pawn. Now only white's rook can move. So I tried to run it out of moves. King h7, rook check, king h6, rook a6, king g7, rook a7 check, king f8, rook a6. And here I felt I needed to do something because he'll always check me. And I've also just been wanting to see if he does move the king. He hasn't. He's passed that test. He hasn't fallen for the trap. So if I played king f7, then I felt that we would just continue back and forth and it would be a draw. And the computer does give this as being drawn. So what's my plan? My plan is to try and entice him to take on g6. When he does that, I'll play rook c2, take on a2, and we'll both have two passed pawns on opposite sides of the board. My thinking is that the pawns are both about as advanced as each other, but my two pawns are connected. So I felt that the fact that my pawns were connected should win. They should be better than his pawns, and therefore it will either be easier for me to push them and get them further advanced, or at some point I could sacrifice my rook for maybe one or two of his pawns, and my pawns would be so far advanced that his rook couldn't stop them. So the fact my pawns are better means I have an advantage, in my head anyway. So he didn't take it yet. He wanted to see what I would do, I think. So I played king d8, rook a6, and then I have several options of what to do with my king. I thought king c7 would make it a little bit too obvious what I had planned, and also is just as good as the square I put it on anyway. I played king d7. So now the idea is that if he does not take the pawn, I'm then going to play king c6 and maybe king d5. So, or king b7 maybe. And then he'd run out of checks and have to take the pawn. So let's see what happens. Rook takes a7, rook a7, king c6, rook a6 check. Now king b7 I think is best. It just stops any checks from white. So now he has to take, and I've drawn him into this forcing line. And the computer line here is rook g5, king b6, h6, then white cuts me off, check, and we get this very funny line where it's still technically drawn, and I have a slight initiative because he's in check now, which means I'll be able to bombard him with checks. I probably don't have enough to win in terms of a computer evaluation, and if we both played like computers. But at this point, he was starting to get a little low on time, and he could very easily make an error. I know I could too, but I'm the one with the attack. I'm the one with the checks. So it's far more likely he'll be the one who blunders, makes a terrible mistake, and I can profit from it. So even though it is drawn objectively, subjectively, in terms of human play, I think I have a good chance of winning this game. So it is technically drawn, but it's very difficult to draw. He doesn't keep checking me, though. He instead just takes the pawn. And my king on b7 is slightly better than the king on d7. So here, it is still just about drawn. I play rook c2, then h5, rook takes a2, h6. Now his pawn is more advanced than mine, so I can't have that. I play rook g2 check first, and this is an important nuance of the position. He needs to now protect his rook with the king by putting it on h5 or f5. If king h5, I could then play rook h2 check. The king would move back to maybe g4 or g5, and then my rook is behind his passed pawn, and that would mean I could more easily push my two pawns up the board. And because they're connected, they can protect each other. So my rook is not going to be tied down to defending the pawns like his rook will be. So king f5 was played, and this also, after rook h2, there's another advantage of me forcing his king to f5, which is that when I get my pawn to the other end, or if I get my pawn to the other end, it will be check. If I get pawn to b1, his king will be in check. So that gives me, in effect, an extra tempo, where in some positions where I'd be losing, or white would have a good initiative, I would get the initiative. So here, the computer line is king e5, trying to go after my pawns, b3, rook b6, a4, h7, rook takes, rook b7, king c6, rook takes, b2, rook check, king b5, rook h7, a3, rook a7, king c4 just to prevent rook b7 skewering, rook takes a3, queen b1 equals queen. And after rook e3, I think this is technically winning for black, but this is incredibly hard to win. And I would have played on, but I think my chances would have been reduced a great deal. So that does, in a way, it does prove and justify the fact that my pawns are better and I can queen even against a whole rook. But that line is probably drawn unless you're a computer. So he didn't play king e5 though. He played rook a6. And again, I'm not really calculating much, but I did figure out that he can't take on a5 because rook h5 check skewers his king to the rook. So I played b3. Rook b6 was played, but king g4 is a very interesting try from the computer. After I play b2, rook b6, and now my rook is tied down to defending the b2 pawn. a4, king g3, so it's either forcing my rook to not defend b2 or to not attack h6. King c7 might be a worthy attempt. Rook b4, rook takes, and this is another draw after a3, rook a2, rook a6. We're going to draw this game. So the computer does find a resource for white. So perhaps his move was slightly better. Rook a6, b3. So instead of king g4, though, he plays rook b6, which is perfectly understandable, which allows me to play a4, protecting the pawn. So again, another use of connected pawns. My rook now is free to attack h6 and not bother about my two pawns. King g6, going after an h7 push. King c7. So I'm trying to force his rook away, or put it on a less useful square. Rook b4, b2, h7. So we each have a pawn one square from promotion. And again, the deciding factor is that his pawns are not connected. So I play a3, f5, so he's trying to throw up both pawns. But now, I did have a look at a move, and I felt justified now in playing it, because this is only, I think, the second time in the game that I have calculated something, and this is from experience, while I calculate, and it does show that I may not be a brilliant player, but I have enough experience to figure out whether this line draws or not. a2 is a very tempting move, but rook takes b2 is very, very annoying. And I could play rook takes b2, he makes a queen, I make a queen, but then he would bombard me with lots and lots of checks. So, okay, if I make a queen at once, he can take the rook. I can then play queen g1 check, king f7, queen takes h2. So I'm against two pawns. I should win, right? Okay, take about 5 seconds, well, 10 seconds, and decide whether you think it's won or drawn for black. Well, even on a table base, which has lots of stocked positions and can tell you in an instant whether it's won or drawn, it is drawn here. The thing that swung me was that normally in this type of position, if the f-pawn were removed from the board, it would be absolutely drawn. But because white can move the f-pawn, he won't have the stalemate resource, which is when he plays king h8. So in this position, if he played king h8, it's not stalemate because he could then play f6 next move. But my king is a little bit too far away to come over and checkmate him. So here, after king there, I don't have any access points with my queen. Normally what I would do is play queen h6, king g8, and then queen g6 check. But here, of course, I can't do that, and there isn't really any other good square for me to go to. So I am eventually forced to take the pawn, which will lead us to the book draw here. And once my queen moves away to stop stalemate, he'll then play king g8 again, or king g7, threatening h8 queen. So that position was drawn, and I did calculate out that this would be almost certainly drawn, and I didn't want him to be low on time, but have a position where it was very, very easy to see what moves to play. So I didn't play a2 here. I played rook h1, which is much, much easier than playing a2. And at this point, it's practically impossible for white to draw. It's completely won for black, and I can't see any resources that could get me to go wrong. So if king g7, for example, trying to play h8, queen, I have a2 now, rook takes b2, and a1 queen, which pins his rook. Then it's very, very simple to win. And yeah, this is one. So he can't play king g7. He plays instead f6. Now I play a2. And if rook takes b2, a1 queen should win without any difficulty. But instead, so just to show this, he'll put me in check a few times, and then I'll have a checkmate very, very soon. So he doesn't take. Instead, he tries one last time to play f7, but his king is on a rather unfortunate square. So b1 equals queen check, rook takes b1, b1 equals queen check, and here he resigned as I think it's mate in about 4 moves or so. So it was a very interesting position, and I was rather happy to have won it, as we had basically a drawn position. And one thing also that I don't generally do in my games, even in tournaments, is I don't check their rating or their grading, because if I do, I'll then be worried that I need to win, or draw, or whatever, and I'll be then thinking constantly about my grading performance. So I just generally assume my opponent is very strong and about my level, and then I'm not disappointed if I draw, win, lose, no matter what the result. Then I check their grade afterwards, and what will be will be. If I draw with someone rated 120, then I've done so. But he was rated 165, so a draw would not have been good, and a win does keep my performance rating about the same. And in the match, it turned out that I didn't need to win. We won 5-3 in the end. So if I had have drawn, we'd have won 4.5, 3.5. So I didn't need to worry that much about the result. I just had to not lose. But I felt that this game was useful in showing that judgment can be very useful in your games, to rely on instinct. However, even the strongest players do need to calculate in some positions. And my game could have been improved a lot by calculating. I just don't think I had the energy, or whatever you want to call it, to calculate variations. So, for example, the big one for me was taking the pawn. Just in terms of judgment, moving a piece that I've already developed probably should have been a warning sign. I should have just castled, and that would have come under instinct or judgment. Just castling, developing, getting my king safe, etc. But my more materialistic side came out, and I thought, oh, a pawn. I'll take that pawn. It doesn't look too bad. I'm attacking the queen. Then I might be able to play bishop b4, threatening a discovered check. So there, I should have taken the time to calculate, and that was a point where I had to. And I was very lucky that I didn't lose, and I did have a resource of bishop takes e5. If earlier bishop e7 had been played, I would have... also, not bishop e7. If the bishop hadn't moved, if I'd, say, played bishop d7, so I'd moved the other bishop, then I could have just resigned, because I'd have been losing a piece, which wouldn't have been very fun. So in that position, I needed calculation. And here, I should have spent more time calculating, but I felt that my judgment was good enough that I could take off white's good minor piece and activate my pieces. So this was good judgment, having a plan of simply throwing up my queenside pawns and attacking. But then again, I could have ended the game far quicker and gone home early if I had calculated the key move in this variation, rook e8. So overall, you need both. You need to calculate positions and look at the tactics, most importantly, before looking at small positional things. And then after you've calculated and seen there might be 2 or 3 options available to you, which are good tactically and positionally, then I would generally rely on your own instinct to tell you which move looks more natural or which looks best to you. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Comment, like, subscribe. Bye.